Alright, so today we'll be talking about Chapter 2, Section 3, and the title of it is Puritan New England. The English Puritans came to the Americas beginning in the 1620s. So from the early days of the English settlement in what is today the original 13 colonies of the United States, we have Puritans coming here. And they're an interesting group of people worth studying because a large number of our earliest immigrants were from this group. So who were they? Well, Puritans are a religious group. They were originally part of the Church of England, but they hoped to purify the church or reform it from within, hence the name Puritan. And the Church of England resented this attempt at reformation and ousted them. So eventually many Puritans wound up coming here. Another important group of pilgrims coming here were separatists. And separatists were those who felt that the English church was too corrupt to reform and removed themselves from it for religious reasons. And so these two groups of people, fleeing England to escape persecution, founded Plymouth Colony in New England. And so they came here for religious reasons. And it was some of these early pilgrims or religious travelers who emphasized the idea of a separation of church and state because they saw the corruption that stemmed from a too close connection between religion and government. And then we have the Massachusetts Bay Company. In 1630, a joint stock company, which we should know what that is, again a private venture, founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This was a Puritan colony, meaning that these were Christians coming over to escape religious persecution because of their unique ideas about Christianity that conflicted with the Anglican Church. The first governor of this colony was John Winthrop, who was a Puritan himself. And so these people aimed to found a community where they could practice their unique brand of Christianity in peace.
In September of 1626, 35 saints and 67 strangers set sail from the port of Plymouth on the coast of England. Their goal, to establish a second permanent English colony in North America.
These were people
primarily defined by their religious identity. They were Puritans,
which was a term
that meant that they were trying to purify the Protestant religion.
They felt that it had not sufficiently broken with Catholic precedent.
There were too many ceremonies and
too much of the church hierarchy
that had been carried over from Catholicism. They were increasingly in conflict with the king and with the upper hierarchy of the church, the bishops and the archbishops,
didn't think that
the church should make any more changes,
that it reached just the right
level of reformation. And they then proceeded to try to purge the church of these Puritan elements.
The group had been granted permission to settle in northern Virginia, but when they arrived at Cape Cod instead, outside London Company territory, they draw up a document to legitimize their position before they leave the ship.
We whose names are
the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James,
do by these presents, solemnly and mutually, in ye presence of God and one of another,
covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic,
and by virtue hereof to enact laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices
from time to time,
as shall be thought most meet and convenient for ye general good, of the colony, to which we promise all due submission and obedience.
It isn't long before
Other Puritans decide to risk the voyage.
Especially after the mid-1620s, when there was a new king, King Charles I,
and some new archbishops
who were hardliners about trying to suppress Puritanism.
Many Puritans in England
thought that they needed to get out.
The people
who embark on these journeys are quite different from those who signed on for passage to the Chesapeake.
People have in fact analyzed the ship lists,
and we know a lot about the early settlement patterns,
what towns they went to, what patch of land they lived on, and so on,
and who they brought
with them, because colonial New Englanders were nothing if not
lots and
lots of records.
The dominant
migration would have been families
with parents in their late
20s, 30s, even early 40s. That's people of some substance and maturity.
There were people who owned some property, who owned their own farm, or their own shop back in England. And so we have much more of an age spectrum. Children, young adults, to even old people who are going together as intact family groups. They're going with some property of their own. They're paying their own way.
Some people crossed because they were drawn by the prospect of cheap or free land. Some people were drawn by a spirit of adventure. Some people were disappointed and went back. But the majority of New Englanders were sort of self-selecting Puritans who wanted to establish a godly community in the New World, the kind of community that they had tried and failed to establish in the Old World. People often say that the Puritans came to New England because they were being persecuted in Old England. There's an element of truth to that, but many people in England might have said that the Puritans left because they had tried and failed to persecute everybody else in England, and that they now want to persecute others in North America.
If you looked at that, you would find large numbers of people who came with a congregation.
Maybe not everybody in the congregation,
but a big subset of a church in England would travel together, and would settle.
And that's one reason all you have to do is
look at the place names of
compare them to Old England,
to see a lot of that kind of continuity.
And then of course there's the word of mouth. Riding back. People who are in effect
kind of advanced scouts.
We're here.
It looks good. You should come over.
There are people who write and say,
I have never been so miserable in my whole life, and I wish I could come home.
As an Englishman studying early American history, I think it's very important to recognize that when people crossed the Atlantic, they didn't dump all their cultural baggage overboard. They were very much Englishmen and Englishwomen living in a new world. That new world transformed their lives in many respects, but they still, in many other respects, remained a product of the culture they had come from. So it's important for us to understand the culture they came from and the way in which the various attitudes and structures that they brought with them gradually, but only gradually, transformed and adapted in these very different circumstances. But rather than thinking of the colonists as Americans, it's in some ways more helpful and perhaps more revealing to think about the interaction between their identity as English men and women and their experiences in this very different environment, which then remade, reconstituted their Englishness, their Europeanness in very fascinating ways.
Now, the Puritan people who came here were devoutly religious in a way that may be difficult to relate to. Entire churches would uproot from England, board a ship, travel together, and settle a new community together, and die together and have their babies and all the sort. You know, it's an interesting culture. And you saw aspects of their dress from the recreations in the video. Extreme modesty, extreme devoutness. In fact, many of these Puritans came here purely for religious reasons, for establishing some type of religious utopia or religious community. And they, many in their writings, even called this the city upon a hill, the New Jerusalem, if you will. They felt this manifest destiny that God had given them this land to dwell on. Well, in the Puritan communities, only adult men were allowed to vote. The basic structure was a judicial system called a general court and an executive branch called a governor. And these would be chosen by the adult males in the community. The government and the church were intertwined in these Puritan communities. That means there was no separation of church and state in these early Puritan settlements, and we'll see what happened as a result of that soon. But the government officials, the governor and the general court, were also members of the church. In fact, they had to be members of the church to be members of this government. And they felt they had a duty to do God's will. Now, as I said, the Puritans generally came here as whole family groups. Grandpa, grandma, mom, dad, kids, parents, ministers, neighbors, other church members all coming together. Among the Puritan communities, the people in these communities felt they had a responsibility to each other to make sure that each of them adhered to the strict principles of Puritan teachings. Meaning that it was the community's responsibility to rebuke those who are in sin. It's the community's responsibility to provide a structure of consequences for those who do wrong, and to make sure they behave in a, quote, God-fearing way.
That is, of course, a matter of some ongoing discussion and debate. People have generally talked about it in regional terms because the groups that come are very much differentiated by the region in England from which they come, the region, the American colonies to which they come, and the motives that animated them, as well as the social profile of the group, does vary significantly.
For example, the fact that some of the colonists had encountered Irish resistance to colonization during the latter half of the 16th century influences their attitude toward Native Americans.
The sorely Irish is a very barbaric people who needed to be settled and civilized, and they were disconcerted by the unwillingness of many of the Irish to go along with this. And they certainly came to North America with a very lively sense of the dangers, the challenges of settling a land in which there was already a group of people living that were allegedly savage and certainly culturally very different and disconcertingly uncooperative at times. The initial experiences of explorers in North America resulted in two very different sets of expectations. On the one hand, Native Americans seemed to be very friendly and cooperative and generous-spirited. On the other hand, they seemed to be, from a European perspective, horrifyingly different, which for them meant inferior and savage. And there was a tremendous ambivalence on the part of the early colonists whether to perceive the Native Americans in positive, constructive terms or as a threatening, dangerous obstacle. The fact that the colonists are at first very weak and need Native American cooperation, of course, encourages them to interact with them somewhat constructively.
In the midst of the political and social turmoil that characterizes the reign of Charles I, Puritan merchants obtained a grant of land and a charter from the king to create the Massachusetts Bay Company.
They discover that unlike other corporate charters, there is no residency clause in the Massachusetts Bay Company. It doesn't say the Massachusetts Bay Company of London, Virginia Company, the Virginia Company of London. It doesn't say anything like that. And so what they do is take the charter along to America with them, and over the course of a little more than 10 years, they convert it into a functioning constitution for the colony itself. So it's really not a money-making operation in itself, the way the Virginia Company is supposed to be. It really is a structure for a colony.
Massachusetts Bay was economically the most successful, geographically the most expansionist of the New England colonies, was an irritant to the crown. From the very beginning, Massachusetts Bay, and more broadly, had a high sense that local prerogatives, local authority, local privileges were important. So that in New England, they saw themselves as recapturing the authority that had been undersold by Charles I.
And so they established the town meeting, what is to become the cornerstone of community life, of local control.
Now, another very interesting colony is the colony of Providence and what today became Rhode Island. This was founded by a man named Roger Williams. He was one of these separatist ministers. He had controversial views that conflicted with the Anglican Church, to the point in which he felt that he and his congregation must leave the Church of England. But he had some controversial views even in the New World. You see, he felt that the English settlers had no rightful claim to the land upon which they dwelt unless they purchased it from the Native Americans. Otherwise, they are committing theft.
Well, that's flawed.
Yeah.
Native Americans don't believe that you can buy land.
Well, and that's a good point. The Native Americans believed that land was more of a communal commodity. But Roger Williams does have an interesting point. That he felt that we must do unto others as we would have them do unto us. Really? What kind of crazy idea is that? Let me say it again. He felt that we must do unto others as we would have them do unto us. What an idiot, right? I don't know. The golden rule doesn't make sense. Okay. I try. Well, what I'm trying to say is he was one of the few leaders of a New World colony that actually sought to treat the Native Americans as decent people. And for this, his ideas were considered extreme. And though you've got a point that the natives viewed land ownership in a much different way, he also taught that the Puritan government had no right to punish settlers for worshiping according to their conscience. And he also distanced himself from the Massachusetts Bay Colony because of this. If you're ever traveling through the Northeast, Rhode Island and Massachusetts are right next to each other. A few miles. It's not that far. And these colonies were close to one another and had some communication. And Roger Williams' concept of freedom of religion was viewed as very controversial. Because yes, the Puritans came here to escape religious persecution, and yes, they came here to establish a religious colony where they could believe according to their conscience. But if you lived in that colony, you better worship the way they did. In fact, we'll talk about witch burning here soon. Yeah, that was a thing. So, there was not really a sense of religious toleration in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But yet, Providence, Rhode Island practiced tolerance towards the Native American peoples and freedom of religion. So tolerance of different peoples and, Carly, freedom of religion. These are very important concepts. Concepts that we consider to be fundamental to the American way of life, yet they were viewed as extreme at the time. In fact, I want you to consider this. For daring to have those two main beliefs of freedom of religion and tolerance toward the native peoples, the General Court of the Massachusetts Bay Colony ordered Roger Williams to be arrested to be arrested for daring to teach that if you want to believe what you want to believe, that's your right to do so. For daring to teach that you should treat the native peoples as you would want to be treated. This was considered a crime in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And so he was ordered to be arrested. And he fled the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he founded his own colony at Providence, Rhode Island. And it's a very interesting place. You can go, Providence is still a town. You can go visit. It's very beautiful. This new colony adhered to these ideas of Roger Williams and peacefully negotiated with the local tribes for a parcel of land upon which they could settle. They came to a mutual agreement. And in this community, there would be, by law, a separation of church and state and religious freedom. Pretty neat stuff. Another neat story within the Puritan community is Anne Hutchinson. And I think several neat things about her story. Number one, she's a woman. And she is a preacher or a minister. During a time, well, there are even still churches today that preach that women cannot be ministers. But especially in the time of the Puritans, it was believed to be immoral for a woman to even speak publicly or hold any measure of authority over a man. That was considered immoral at this time. And I think in many ways Anne Hutchinson was a hero, if for nothing else in the fact that she was brave enough to get up to express what she believed. And she had a large number of followers. She had the audacity to preach that people have the right to read and interpret scriptures or read and understand religion for themselves. That ministers could help, they could counsel, but it was not the job of ministers to tell people what to believe. Whoa. Wait a second. Now imagine that you're a Puritan in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. You wear black head to toe. You wear this big giant hat. The only visible part of your body is your face. Women wear bonnets covering their head at all times. We're essentially the Taliban here, living in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Extreme modesty. Extreme fundamentalism. They put people in stocks for public drunkenness. They put people in stocks for, quote, ungodly behavior. And here is a woman who was outspoken and courageous enough to tell people that they had the right to interpret their faith as they chose. And guess what they did to her?
They killed her.
No, we'll burn some witches soon. Hang on, we're not yet burning witches. We'll get there. Yeah, I know. But what do you think happened to her?
They arrested her.
She got vanished.
Yeah. They probably, had she stuck around, they probably would have arrested her. Had she really persisted, eventually maybe they would have burned her. I don't know. But her particular story, she was told to leave. She was exiled. She was kicked out of the community. And her family and her followers, her congregants, all left together. If you were watching the reenactment of the case, she quoted a verse in Titus which gave women the right, Titus is a book in the New Testament, gave women the right to instruct younger women. And the judge contradicted her with a verse in the Corinthians. And I looked it up. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 5 or 7. And it says, women are to remain silent in the churches. If they have a question, they are to ask their husband at home. Now, again, we read that and we're like, whoa, that's hardcore. Well, people of that time interpreted that quite literally.
What was the reference?
1 Corinthians 11, either verse 5 or verse 7. And pretty sure it's 1 Corinthians. But double check me on that. But anyway, we read that and we're like, whoa, messed up. Women have the right to be teachers, be doctors, lawyers, and maybe soon even presidents. So, the concept of the immorality of women holding authority over men, I think history has debunked that. But at this time, it was considered extreme enough that this woman was ousted from her community for daring to teach others and daring to instruct that people have the right to interpret their faith for themselves. Now, there were a number of disputes over land among these New England colonies. As settlers in the Massachusetts Bay Colony began to spread west from Massachusetts, founding the colonies of New Hampshire and Connecticut, they did so through treaties with the Native Americans. The attempt was to live peacefully with their neighbors. However, there was a fundamental misunderstanding. You see, many of these natives thought that these treaties were temporary and that the land would be granted back to them at a set time. However, the Europeans generally viewed these treaties as permanent. And it does go back to that misunderstanding about land ownership, that the natives thought that they would temporarily dwell on this land, that it was a public commodity, if you will, like camping in the forest. But yet the Europeans viewed it in much more of a business transaction, that to the point where it became theirs. And this led to an actual war. You see, Julissa, one of the tribes to stand up to these New Englanders were the Pequots. And they felt that they had been cheated, that they were being lied to, that instead of a temporary treaty upon which they would dwell there until they found a more permanent place to stay, it's almost like saying, hey, you can crash on my couch. And then suddenly that person starts moving their things in. Starts small, right? So, hey, you can stay on my couch for a little bit. And then you see a lamp. Like, where'd that lamp come from? Oh, that's mine. Yeah, and then, why? Where's that laptop? What's that? Oh, that's mine. Huh. Yeah, and then suddenly, okay, why are all these clothes all around? Well, and then posters. And, well, I thought I'd make it like my old room. Well, I said you could crash on my couch. I didn't say you could move in. And I think that's the fundamental misunderstanding. Now, again, what do you do in that situation? Well, eventually, if they persist, you got to run them off. Well, how do you do that? Well, it gets really awkward if it's a friend. But what do you do if it's a group of people who you've invited to temporarily stay on part of your land?
Bacon has the right. It's like, I'm going to set fire to it and they'll be gone.
Yeah, and then what do? You got to run off a group of people. So you approach them and you say, hey, can you leave? Yeah, exactly. It's time. You got to go. And they say, and then they produce that document that says, but you gave us permission. We're staying. And they're like, no, that's not exactly what we meant. Well, what do we do? Well, eventually things are going to get ugly, and that's where the Pequot War came in. The Pequots took a stand against the colonists to attempt to get them to leave, because they had never promised that they could stay permanently. And the colonists actually said, no, we're not going to leave. And so this is the case where you say, okay, guy on the couch, it's time to go. And guy on the couch races up and knocks you down.
No, you're like, you don't pay rent. All right, bye.
Yeah. Not only does he knock you down, but you wind up leaving your own house. That's what happened. Yeah. I know, we have laws and all that, but the point is that It's not pleasant. In fact, on a larger scale, the Puritans were not only staying on land that had not been permanently promised to them, but in many cases they were forcing the natives to do work for them. Oh my gosh, so now the guy on the couch is eating out of my fridge? Come on! Like, it's just not right anymore. The natives were being forced to follow Puritan laws. I mean, now guy on the couch is playing video games when my shows are on. Come on, not even cool.
Bro.
Yeah, not cool. So, they were being forced to follow the Puritan laws. They were being forced to give up their land and to even do work for the English. And so, a chief of the Wampanoag, the Wampanoag chief named Metacom, organized a confederation of tribes. You see, individual tribes had tried to stand up to the colonists, but the colonists typically had advanced technology, guns and cannons, and were able to defeat the tribes. However, this chief attempted to unite a number of different tribes against a common enemy, these English settlers. And the goal was to wipe them out. Enough was enough. They were going to finally rid New England of these unwanted guests. And this was called King Philip's War. The war was characterized by terrible casualties, wanton destruction of not only life but also property and crops, which led often to fierce hunger and disease, and the eventual defeat of the tribes, because it was a colonial victory. And while it was a colonial victory, it was very disastrous for all involved. We could call this a Pyrrhic victory, meaning there was a winner, but really everybody lost. Because 16 colonial villages were entirely destroyed throughout this war. 1/10 of the men among the New England colonies were dead as a result of this war. Now, the Wampanoag casualties were quite severe. In fact, they were nearly wiped out. And this was effectively the end of native power in southeastern New England.